Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Gleadle, and I'm the CEO of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be introducing today's webinar, which is on the geopolitics of the COVID-19. We've got some outstanding speakers, so I know that today will be a great learning opportunity for us all. There's a few housekeeping rules, and I'll draw your attention to the chat section for that. But without any more ado, I'd like to hand you over to our moderator, George Cunningham, who is the chair of Liberal Democrats Overseas. Over to you, George.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed, Christopher. And it's a pleasure for me to be moderating for the first time such a panel, and a great honor to also be doing it in the under the auspices of the Paddy Ashdown Forum in association with Europe Liberal Forum. So I'm the chairman of Lib Dems Overseas, 833 members and supporters in 40 countries outside Europe. Believe it or not, a local party rather than a global party. Anyway, so I just want to say that we've got some great speakers today, Dr. Christine Cheng and Professor Paul Reynolds. But I'd just like to say a few words on the topic of the geopolitics of COVID-19 to kick off. The pandemic is an unprecedented global challenge affecting all humanity, which is suffering the consequences at very considerable social economic cost. But is COVID-19 creating a completely new world order, or is it rather both accelerating and exacerbating current global trends in a major way? The world has already seen and been in disorder before COVID-19 made its appearance. The crisis had already seen a deepening of great power rivalry between China and the United States. This has been aggravated by a far-reaching trade war started some time before the pandemic hit. Mainland China is said to have taken advantage of COVID-19 in taking a more aggressive stance towards Hong Kong, Taiwan, and in the South China Sea, as well as conducting brutal diplomatic and disinformation campaigns alongside Russia, as well as conducting which have been targeted Western democracies. COVID-19 has also diminished the US capabilities in the Pacific, for instance, with aircraft carriers docked because of COVID-19 cases amongst its crews. The COVID-19 crisis may also well accelerate deglobalization, at least in the short run. Many stress the need for decreasing dependencies, protecting critical infrastructure, and ensuring security of supply chains. At the start, there were unilateral and uncoordinated approaches towards the pandemic by many countries. Although coordination is better now, and noble measures are underway to try and ensure the eventual vaccine is a public health good, the scramble between countries to be first to have their populations vaccinated will surely test the world's ability to cooperate together again next year. COVID-19 has also been an opportunity for some governments to crack down on freedoms. On the one hand, anti-government political protests petered out in places like New Delhi, Hong Kong, and Thailand because of the dangers associated with large crowds spreading the virus more easily. But now, according to Europol, the lockdown and confinement has also resulted in increased radicalization of societies, with an upsurge of violence from the extreme right and extreme left, egged on by forces aiming at further destabilizing Western societies. Countries with little respect for human rights have been taking advantage of the world's focus on COVID-19 to clamp down stronger on human rights defenders, minorities, and other elements they consider undesirable. So how can liberty be ensured when liberalism is under attack? Can the liberal order re-establish its reputation and fight back successfully? Will authoritarian and systemic rival China win? And what are the consequences? Or will freedom eventually overcome, as it has managed to do ultimately so far? Our panelists have a big job on their hands and a very tough topic. And I look forward very much, first of all, to call upon Christine Cheng to give her presentation. Thank you.
Cheers. It's a pleasure to be here. And strangely enough, I'm here now in my professional capacity with my normal international relations hat on and not with my full-on Lib Dem hat on. But I think there This is a fascinating topic, and there's a lot that's being done on it. And I just want to highlight that there's a parallel conversation going on through a consultation process with the Federal Policy Committee that is just about to open up. And when you get the invitation to come and join in this conversation, we would love for you to do so. So I'll take off my FPC hat and now put on my IR hat. Thank you so much to Christopher and to George for hosting this, to Paul and Marlene for inviting me to be here and to talk to you all about something that I've been thinking about an awful lot. So I'm going to frame my remarks in the context of this question. So how has COVID reshaped geopolitics? And I want to look at it through the lens of UK-China relations, because it's basically what we care about here in this forum. But I think it also illuminates bigger geopolitical changes that are going on in the world that we can see very, very clearly through what is going on through the UK. So that's how I want us to think about this issue. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just share my screen with you with a very interesting tweet that came out a few months ago. And I'll talk you through why I think it's important. So here we go. So can you just give me a thumbs up if Marlene and Paul, George, you can see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. So there are two slides that I just want to show you. So this is a polling survey of all British adults, and it was taken just at the very end of the year pre-COVID. And it asks a really simple question. From what you know, how would you rank the following countries and groups of countries in terms of their importance in the world? And so, those aren't even all countries, by the way. So we'll set that aside, but it gives some context for how we're thinking about this, right? So what does the British population think in terms of where the UK sits in the world relative to everybody else? So if you look broadly, the UK sees itself as the #2 country in the world. However it is that you want to define influence or importance or status or whatever, most, writ large, most British people think that we are #2 in the world. I'm not sure that that's an accurate representation, especially because this is a Lib Dems overseas group. I doubt that most Lib Dems would see it this way. Let me show you the second slide, which I think is also very, very interesting. A quarter of British adults think that the UK is the most important country in the world, the #1 most important country in the world. Okay, so that's going to frame what I'm going to say next now. And I'm going to stop screen sharing, if I can figure out how. Hold on a second. There you go. So that's just to put into context the rest of the things that I'm going to say about the evolution of, I think, Brexit and the UK-China relationship. So, I guess in the lead up to where we are now, we've always thought about China within the UK as somewhat of a both benevolent force, but also becoming increasingly authoritarian. And we're kind of stuck in the not quite sure what kind of relationship we want to have with China, right? So on the one hand, it is both the world's greatest development story in history, going from $1,000 GDP per capita in 2001 when it joined the WTO to $9,800, and then per GDP per capita, taking millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and really transforming the global economic system. So from a Lib Dem perspective and from a liberal perspective, that is a great success. On the other hand, it's not quite the kind of modernization that we anticipated would happen coming out of inviting China to join the WTO, right? We thought it would be a democratization story where closer trade and closer alignment with the West would actually flip China into becoming more like us. And instead, that's not what has happened, right? It's something very different has happened that I don't think we could have anticipated, partly because we weren't thinking far enough ahead, but that the UK specifically hasn't really played a great role in this, but the changing of those dynamics was not has not happened in the direction that we were hoping for, right? So some of the things that have highlighted the recent changes you can see with the Hong Kong protests, with the Huawei contract here in the UK, and not just here, but broadly across the West in lots of different countries. We're seeing, of course, in the UK, the need for some kind of post-Brexit trade deal. And so that has compromised our ability to speak out on both issues relating to China, but just issues more broadly. And of course, we need PPE. And who makes the most PPE in the world? It's China, right? So a lot of these things are changing our ability to talk about, well, what we really need out of this relationship and where the world is going. So, you know, the two biggest actors normally who would speak out on this stuff are the US and the UK, both of whom are silenced at a particular moment where we really need those voices. So the leading voices on democracy have been somewhat silenced. And we see also that China's becoming increasingly aggressive with respect to its neighbors, especially within its regional sphere in terms of the South China Sea, and even with respect to Australia, right? So we see tariffs being imposed on Australia for daring just to come out and say, hey, the WHO needs a public inquiry into what has happened with respect to the early stages of the coronavirus and China not sharing its information. So look, we've basically got a rising China that is becoming more aggressive and more willing to put its money where its mouth is and be quite coercive in terms of what it needs. So the question then is, okay, well, what does the UK do about this, right? So where do we stand on this issue as Lib Dems, and how should we be thinking about this? And I think a good chunk of this answer has to be through a closer alignment with Europe. And I think this is obvious to those of you who've been following these issues, going back to those earlier graphs that I was showing you. I think objectively, the EU is quite a powerful actor, and it's really the only actor that is still willing to stand up to China. And I think that's something that we should cling close to as liberals, right? That this is actually a really positive way of engaging, and we can still be quite robust in calling out the problems that have arisen without necessarily alienating. But this has to happen as part of a coalition of countries. And I say this in part because I am also a Canadian, right? I was brought up as a Canadian, and I'm watching a saga unfold with respect to two Canadian citizens who've been kidnapped and basically held as hostage in a fight between the US and China over Huawei. And Canada is one of those countries that's been caught in between. Of course, Canada, you know, the UK is not Canada, but we can see where this is going. And without some kind of concerted, collective action against this type of move, I think everybody is going to be subjected to behaviors that are not unlike this. So what do we do, right? I think that the next question is, what does, you know, the party do? What does the UK do? How should we respond to these kinds of things? Well, part of it is that we can't stop cooperating with China on things like climate change, right? That's got to happen. There's going to be lots of common interests, and there are absolutely issues where we have to fight together as, you know, globally, like the pandemic. I think that's a perfect example. But of course, there will be opportunities to exploit a geopolitical advantage in these circumstances, and we just have to be very, very wary of what that looks like. I really think that the 5G issue is going to be a wedge issue, even if it's not being put forward on a global stage as such. It is absolutely happening behind the scenes, right? So this is probably the one thing that China really, really wants right now and feels like it can extract out of the circumstances in exchange for various political favors on PPE, just as an example. That's what certainly I would be doing if I was on the Chinese side. So I'm just thinking about how do we go about this? How do we respond? And then where do we sit in the world? And I think you need to be both robust. We need to be robust as a party in being able to call out the things that are still going on, like as with the Uyghurs, as with the two Michaels that have been kidnapped, as with all sorts of human rights abuses, as with Hong Kong. And I think actually, you know, for once the Tories did the right thing here. I think that was a bold move on behalf of Dominic Raab. So I will applaud that particular move. But I think more broadly, it's a difficult place where the UK stands and how to move forward on this. And it's trying to tread this very fine line between both being a leader of democracies, but also having, being the recipient of the largest amount of Chinese investment within Europe. So we want the money, but we don't want the consequences that come with taking the money. And we just need to be very, very mindful of where we stand on these issues. And I think every once in a while, there will be a trade-off. You can't have it both ways. And where that stands, the best way to combat that is really with Europe, and then with closer collaboration with countries like South Korea, like Vietnam, like Canada, Australia, and obviously our closest allies. So I'll leave my remarks there, and I'm looking forward to what Paul has to say about these issues.
Thank you very much, Christine. That's been really tremendous. And now over to Paul. Tell us, Paul.
Thank you, George, and thank you to the Paddy Ashdown Forum and European Liberal Forum, and thanks to Merlin and Chris setting up the meeting, and thanks to Christine. I'm going to do a little bit of a know your adversary thing, or some people might say know your enemy, depending on your point of view. And on the basis that doing a know your adversary is more effective at dealing with problems than just demonizing your adversary or your enemy, especially if you're in charge of something, governmentally. And just to start very briefly, just by saying something about, I'm just going to try the slide thing, better than watching at my physiognomy. This one. There we go, it's all very high tech. Yeah, so I'm just going to start saying something about the COVID-19 thing. The question, I think, is a very important question, is the extent to which the COVID-19 pandemic is a symptom of declining relations in China, or to some extent even a cause of it. And that sounds like a controversial thing to say, but my point is that part of China's behavior over COVID-19 relates to how the Communist Party in China thinks and how it sees itself and its vulnerabilities. And we can talk a bit later about the specifics in terms of the World Health Organization. But I think the circumstantial evidence is sufficient to conclude that whilst China did meet its treaty obligations with the WHO treaty, which is the IHR, International Health Regulations, whilst it formally met those treaty obligations, there was clearly a delay in reporting to the WHO. And I think in the fullness of time, we'll know more about that. And I believe that the delay relates to how China sees itself and some of the vulnerabilities. And to some extent, there's quite a lot of paranoia in the Chinese leadership about US intentions and what its the threats which it perceives. I mean, people know the map of China and so on, but just to kind of look around at the countries which surround it and some of the difficulties which they face, and you think of the US bases which are all around China, and this little map doesn't do the whole job, but I mean, because there are lots of bases in US bases in Afghanistan, for example, and they have the capability of sending cruise nuclear missiles potentially across into China and this type of thing. So the Chinese view of the world, they look at this and it fuels their feelings of vulnerabilities. And just from a point of view of the economic vulnerability, I think that the perception which drives a lot of Chinese thinking is the scope for a blockade. That if there was a conflict, if kind of push comes to shove, that China is the largest importer of oil on the planet, and its oil comes across the world through the Straits of Malacca, which is extremely vulnerable to blockade. And it has a big effect on Chinese thinking. The Chinese Communist Party clearly believes that international vulnerabilities lead to domestic vulnerabilities, especially their obsession with being legitimate, because they're not an elected party. And so they're always thinking about the extent to which they're regarded by the population as legitimate or illegitimate. And so if the main sources of legitimacy from their point of view are nationalist ones, you know, we are the people that got rid of the imperialists and this type of thing, this narrative, although of course they didn't give up their imperialist acquisitions themselves. But the other vulnerability is an economic one. There's like a sort of social contract. As long as the country is growing, everybody's going to support the Communist Party. So these two, you know, if the nationalist thing was dented because they lost a war or a skirmish, or if the economy stopped growing at such an enormous rate, then they would feel vulnerable. And a lot of this is the reason for this what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, or the string of pearls in the maritime sense, that the party wishes to deal with this, particularly the possibility of blockade, with this Belt and Road Initiative, which is to shift the center of gravity for exports, because the whole thing is based on exports, across the land mass instead of by sea, to reduce that vulnerability, and that results in this investment across through into Turkey and this relationship they developed with Italy and this type of thing, and then down into Myanmar and Cambodia and these places to kind of go broaden. And then the Chinese have this new facility, the Rakhine State in Myanmar, where they have a gas pipeline and soon to be an oil pipeline going from Rakhine State into Hunan. So this is designed to, again, partially deal with this perceived vulnerability, of which they're one of many. And the string of pearls thing, all of these owning and staffing these ports all around the south of the land mass. And the one I'm most familiar with, which Merlin knows all about, which is in Djibouti. And many of these ports are followed by military agreements, certainly the case in Djibouti and Sri Lanka and so on, and Ethiopia, where the head of the World Health Organization comes from. So this is a key, and we have a couple of yellow circles on the map, one to show the Straits of Malacca, where the oil comes through Singapore, and the other to show where the location of the oil terminal going into Hunan from Myanmar. So they have this string of pearls. And so it's a sort of, you might look at this as an American military approach to China versus China's economic approach. And it will take a long time for them to catch up. And then there's the South China Sea, obviously. If back to the blockade issue, that China is developing these islands and even took over a Vietnamese island aggressively in order to shore up this vulnerability as they see it in terms of the South China Sea. We'll come back to Hong Kong in the discussion. But what I want to conclude about on this in my short time is that things have changed quite a bit. I mean, this view of vulnerabilities is what brought the Chinese leader Xi Jinping to power. I mean, my work was largely the bulk of my work in China was largely under Hu Jintao. And people talk about the trade dispute with the US, and people say this never would have happened under Hu Jintao, because Xi Jinping takes a much more aggressive approach. And there's a specific reason for that, which is that he came to power with the argument that China needs a unified approach, unifying the economic power with the military power. And of course, he was the vice president of the military commission, and he has a close contact with the military. And his idea was that you shouldn't have a collegiate decision making in China. You should have a more unified leadership where you can use these levers of economic and military power together, as we've seen with these ports being followed by military agreements. So this is certainly a more assertive thing. And what was known as, since Deng Xiaoping, what was known as a peaceful rise or peaceful coexistence went out the window with Xi Jinping. And this is sort of because of the threats they see from the US and elsewhere, but more because it's a kind of chicken and egg thing, because the threats, they see the threats from the States, they become more assertive under Xi Jinping, the United States reacts more aggressively, which, you know, and it goes into a spiral. But finally, just the point is that from the European point of view, Europe is now stuck between a spiraling spat between the US and China. And in particular, Donald Trump has clearly decided that China and hatred of China is what's going to win the election for him in November. And therefore, the US like overseas system is pumping out this anti-China propaganda, and you know, not all of it has a full basis in truth, but they're exploiting the difficulties which Europe sees: Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, Taiwan, and South China Sea, and so on, and they're exploiting that. But there is a sort of, you know, if Europe faces a choice between supporting election propaganda designed to re-elect Donald Trump or supporting Chinese propaganda to support its view of the world, that's not a very nice place to be. That's kind of a rock and a hard place. And an independent view is needed from the UK and Europe, and it can only be done with the UK and Europe. The UK can't do this on its own. There has to be a way which is more realistic and more understanding of the vulnerabilities of China, what motivates them, and what sort of things that we can do together. And the main thing from Europe should be to get China not to see the world as China versus the US, and to have more a view from China, which is to see the benefits of an international rules-based system, which they have gone away from. The Americans have gone away from, the Chinese have gone away from, and the Europeans are left holding their arms saying, you know, the rules-based system is what's going to solve the problems that we've got, and including human rights problems and so on. So, you know, we've got to do something and have some initiative and a specific way of going forward if we're to avoid just being, you know, silently in the middle of a spat between the US and China. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have immediately moved, when we talk about geopolitics and COVID-19, to the arena of the US-China dispute. But also don't forget, as has been mentioned, the UK and Europe are there in their uncomfortable rock and a hard place. And there, Europe is having to slowly take a harder and harder line towards China. This is in particular because of the activity of the various diplomats, the embassy in particular of China in Sweden and also in France, that have been quite aggressive towards their host countries and towards the European Union in terms of being very undiplomatic, saying some very undiplomatic words and actions as well. And slowly there is a belief growing that actually we can't do a deal with China. China actually doesn't want to do a deal. And that sort of the overall situation there is the bilateral investment agreement, which everybody hopes desperately means that we can have a level playing field, Europe and China, UK and China. But somehow we can never get to this agreement. And this also, there was a meeting that had been planned, hosted by the German presidency in Leipzig, with the 27 meeting President Xi. This was an event that was planned before COVID-19 happened, and this event has been postponed because there is no sign of this bilateral investment agreement that is somehow to help our economic relationships ever taking place. So there are difficulties, and China has also not just targeted America, but it's targeting countries closer to home, like Australia, in terms of propaganda and disinformation, as well as Europe and others. And we're all feeling there's a sort of intimidation going on. Coupled with that, you have a situation in which at the United Nations, China is trying to redefine things, including what is the meaning of human rights. the Universal Declaration, the interpretation that has been there since 1945, in terms of its own image, and encouraging countries in particular that are involved in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the ones that signed agreements, to support China. So BRI is used also in a diplomatic sense to get support for China. So it's a very uncomfortable situation to be in, and therefore I'm going to read out the first question, which is from Nazreen Davidson, and say, okay, we've got the US elections coming up. How's that going to affect, depending on which president, how is it going to be a second term Trump going to look like versus a Biden in terms of dealing with the situation concerning China as well as COVID-19? And I ask maybe Christine if she could answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I was wondering though, George, would it be possible for Nazreen to actually just introduce herself a little bit so I can get some context for where the question is coming from? I think sometimes people are looking for different things in these questions, and it's always helpful to know, what the background is around the question, if that's all right.
I can only ask Christopher to do that because I'm not able to do that.
Oh, right. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was that everybody else was not able to speak.
No. Christopher, do you want to do it differently, or should we continue this way?
Yeah. Anybody who would like to ask a question, would you actually like to physically ask the question? If you could please let us know through the chat section, and then we can put your audio on so you can actually ask the question, so the panelists can understand the context. So, for example, with Nazreen, would you actually like to ask the question? If you could just quickly let us know. Great. Okay, if you can just bear with me 1 second, and I will. There we are.
I know not everybody wants to speak and feels comfortable speaking, but I think it makes the conversation more fun too.
Hi. Yeah. Hi, Christina.
Hi, it's Hi.
Hi, thanks for inviting me in. So I actually live in the US, and obviously we are, as probably most of the world, is watching avidly to see what's going to happen here. And from my kind of point of view, and my background, to be honest, I was interested to see Paul's slide because my family are from Bangladesh, and I know I'm seeing a lot of activity from China in Chittagong, which is my family's hometown as well. So I do see, everything that is happening on the ground, but also living in the US, what kind of concerns me is that on one side, there's the aggressiveness of the current administration here, but at the same time, I'm just concerned that in terms of where is this going to ultimately take us, because all of it doesn't kind of point to a very kind of balanced perspective in terms of where we want the world to go. So mine is kind of much more broader in terms of, is this a positive to see a potential Democrat government coming in? Or are we so far down the road of China having, taken the ground across many countries, and just in terms of their outreach right now, that it would be very challenging for any future government US government to really kind of reposition and rebalance what I'd say is kind of more equitable power across the region or across globally.
Thanks, Nazreen. I think that's a wonderfully balanced way of thinking about this problem, right? And so first of all, let me just nod along with what Paul has said, because I think it's incredibly helpful context for how we think and approach China that I think is absolutely missing from all of the conversation in the West, right? There's typically zero context for how China thinks about itself, and we have zero understanding about the internal vulnerabilities that China sees on its own. I went to a talk maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago that Jessica Chen Weiss gave at Yale when she was just starting off. It was her job talk. And the number one point that I remember coming out of her job talk was that the thing that China's the most scared of is not external. It is absolutely internal. It is the internal unrest, right? That point that Paul was making about internal legitimacy. So I set that as a context for what I'm going to say next, which is the fear is actually not I think the question that you're posing about where the US is going in some ways doesn't, who is elected next, it absolutely does matter, right? But the direction of travel is still very similar. And that is that it is increasingly anti-Chinese rhetoric of some kind or another. And I think the question is whether or not Joe Biden doubles down on that, but he needs to some extent, because that fervor has been whipped up. And you've already pointed that out, right? Like it's hard to rein back something that has already been let out of the box, right? So it will take what you have unleashed, and as we've seen with Brexit, right, you can unleash a lot of hatred and undo a lot of norms that have taken decades to build up, and then it takes you decades more to get back to that place, right? So in 3 months or 6 months, we've done so much damage that it will take so long to repair those relations that I feel like what you said is somewhat accurate. We are moving in that direction, whether you want to or not. Joe Biden has to follow some of that. He can reel some of it back in over the hopefully 4 to 8 years of Democrats taking over the White House and maybe over the House and Senate as well. But, some of that is already being let out, and it's not just within the US, it's within the West more broadly. So I think part of the answer is yes, absolutely. And then the response to that from the Chinese side that I'm worried about is, well, what happens when that dynamic that Paul was talking about, the ramping up on one side leads to ramping up on the other, and then you lose control of the situation, right? So that's my worry.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, it looks like you wanted to.
I just wanted to, Carl raised an interesting question about, will the US election be, Biden the competent anti-China person versus the Trump incompetent anti-China person? And I think also raises some issues to do with what Nazreen is talking about, which is that from a European point of view, it's very difficult, but very, very important to separate the propaganda of either side from a more realistic kind of mature assessment of China. I mean, China is not going to go away, and so just whipping up hatred against China is not going to work. But there is something specific. The Republican Party has set out a booklet explaining to Republicans up and down the country in relation to the Trump re-election what to say about China, and in particular how to position Biden as not only soft on China, but being in the pocket of China. And so they've got all the phrases are all mapped out. I've got a copy of this. If you Google it, you can find it. It has a name of a law firm on the front of it. They have prepared it, but it's gone out to all the Republican parties across the USA, and it sets out all the lines to take. So basically, it's saying that Biden is in the pocket of Xi Jinping. These are weak, spineless people that won't stand up to China, and so he's hoping to win the election pretty much entirely on that line by the look of what's been sent to the parties up and down the country. And so Europe mustn't get caught up in this. I mean, for people like ourselves and people interested in the subject matter, political parties like the Liberal Democrats, very, very difficult not to be caught up in one set of propaganda or the other and trying to see through the fog. I mean, the idea that you can just not deal with China anymore is that you have to remember, I mean, even things like the Huawei and 5G thing, the 5G telephony thing. I mean, one of the difficulties of China 5G is that China holds most of the patents in 5G. I mean, even if it's Swedish companies or Dutch companies involved, they're still dependent upon the Chinese patents. And let's not forget that China holds a lot of US debt, and the world's reality is that if you have indebted to a particular country, they can, to a great extent, pull the strings. And also, China is embedded in the value chain of industries right across the EU and the US. And just to cut that off, as Trump seems to imply that you can, it is just unrealistic. I mean, it would collapse the US economy. We're all used to everything being made in China, and it takes years and years and years to combat that. I mean, we are dependent upon China for much of the world's growth. I mean, in Africa and so on, and BRI is fueling that. And economic growth in Africa and South America is largely, and to some extent Canada, has been, in Australia, has been based on raw materials and China and Chinese investment. So, you know, this is the concern, I think, that should be the concern in Europe, is that people get swayed by one extreme view or the other and don't take a realistic view. But one of the, I mean, in kinetic conflict, one of the worst things that you can do is to wildly underestimate your adversary. And so I think this is very, very important for us to understand what China does. But the other thing is that people don't, sometimes China doesn't really understand its own situation sometimes, especially with regard to Hong Kong, for example. And you know, if I can share a screen, I might be able to do that. We'll see. Let's try and find the screen. This is what the world, you know, thinks when they think of Hong Kong and China. And it's not really the case. I mean, much of the growth of southern China is dependent upon Hong Kong. I mean, if you are a company director in Shenyang and you manage, by using the 20% privatization law, you manage to siphon off, you know, a few $100 million, you know, where does it go? It goes into Hong Kong. And when it comes back into China, the money enjoys foreign investor privileges. So it's also the Chinese internationalization of the currency, renminbi, is all done through Hong Kong. And if a Chinese company wants to raise, you know, $500 million for a project, and more often than not, it's done in Hong Kong. So a lot of contracts, international contracts with Chinese, large Chinese companies, I mean, they're either signed under Hong Kong law or under English law. So Hong Kong has a much bigger role. I mean, when I was involved in this, you know, even before the Hong Kong 1997 China, people would say, I mean, people openly say in Beijing, Chinese officials, you know, sometimes I wonder whether it's, you know, China taking over Hong Kong or Hong Kong taking over China. You know, people joke like that, but I mean, there is a substance to that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Do we have other questions? Mario, do you want to ask your question? Okay, you want to, it can be read. So Mario says, I'm Argentinian but Mexican since I've spent the last 18 years in Puebla. My question has to do with the way China and Russia has penetrated the Western Hemisphere during the last 10 years or more. How do you interpret the erosion of democracy and liberal values in Latin America in relation to China's inversion and political participation? And therefore, I think, as Paul has spoken a lot, maybe Christine could tackle that one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just paying attention to another message that was sent to me.
The one by Mario, I think, who's been messaging right from the beginning.
How do you interpret? Oh, from the very beginning, not the how do you interpret the erosion of democracy?
I'm Argentinian but Mexican.
Yes, exactly. In relation to China's inversion and political participation. Is that question trying to get at, and I'm sorry, Mario, maybe you can type back, but are you trying to talk about the sort of the Chinese investment in Latin America, or are you more interested broadly just in China's role in changing those dynamics? And more,
I think he's after democracy and liberal values, because, as you know, the European Union has said that you know, China is one of the aspects of working with China is the fact it's a systemic rival. So I think it's more on the systemic rival side.
I mean, I don't think this is necessarily really isolated even to Latin America. I think that's just
No, of
broadly
course.
how China operates, right? Like it's Latin America, in fact, is China's had less of a role in Latin America than I would say in Africa, and and I think, I mean, it's moving in that direction, but I think you can see it actually much more clearly both in neighboring states with Belt and Road, and but really very starkly in Africa because it's a place where, you know, China wasn't really present, I would say 25 years ago, and that has changed dramatically. So where I mostly do my work is in states like I mostly work on West Africa. I mostly work on civil war, right? But what was really pronounced to me in these kinds of spaces is a very different kind of engagement that doesn't look, I would say, much like the way we would tend to engage as donors, right? And I think Paul actually has a version of these stories from his work in Iraq. But, you know, the story that we put forward, and I have a lot of problems with this, but broadly, you know, we say peace building is, after war, is about democracy and elections and changing and rule of law and free markets, right? So, you know, writ large, and then a whole bunch of human rights transformations and so forth, right? So China's way of approaching these sorts of issues, both in Latin America and also in Africa, has been much more commercial, much more, we will let you run your country however it is that you want. We will stay out of your internal affairs and we will be commercial partners with you, and we will do infrastructure building, and look at us. This is the way that we have succeeded over the past 30 years. We have, like you said, Paul, you know, that social contract that has been in place where you get economic growth and we take over political control, and as long as we keep that going, then all is fine, right? And that's basically the model upon which I think they are trying to say to African states, and I think also to Latin American states, this is a different way forward. You don't need to follow the West's model, right? You don't need intrusion into how you run your internal affairs. And this is a different way of doing it. And I think that is a real contrast, right? So I would say that's the framing writ large that we should be thinking about. And so this speaks to the whole DFID FCO merger, with which I am in some ways deeply I have deep problems with, and on the other hand, I can also understand where they're coming from, right? So lots to unpack there, but I'm going to pass it on to Paul because I think he wants to say some stuff about this too, I suspect. Or not.
Over to you, Paul.
Oh, yes, I agree. I mean, I've agreed with everything, pretty much everything Christine has said about that. We really feel this. I mean, around the planet, you know, we feel this. You can no longer say democracy is the most effective way of running, you know, economically. You can't say it anymore. Because people say, oh, what about China? There's no democracy in China, and look at the economic success. Well, you know, it's kind of too early to tell. And it's too early to tell for two reasons, I think. One is that the growth in China, we all hope that it doesn't falter for all sorts of reasons, because it keeps it's the engine of the world economy to a great extent at the moment, especially after COVID-19. Nevertheless, I mean, don't forget the Chinese economy for the last 15, 20 years has been 40% of GDP has been investment. I mean, nobody's ever done that before. And so you know, everyone is assuming that somehow, you know, it will keep going, and when the banks have difficulties, the Chinese authorities intervene very decisively. So I think that's part of the problem. The other difficulty is that if you say, some people say, and I hear this a lot, especially my friends who are more on the personal friends who are more on the far left. In London, you know, you can't avoid them. But they say, oh look, you know, the thing with you know, democracy is more effective, and therefore having a sort of socialist single party setup, you know, is the best thing for the UK. Well, we would take a different view. But the difficulties that we have in the UK economically are as a result of insufficient democracy, not an excess of it. And don't forget that there are lots of countries which you might regard as more democratic than the UK, such as Germany, which has a trade surplus with China and doesn't have an economic problem with China because they export more to China than China exports to Germany. And still everything is made in China when you pick it up, in Germany. So I think that the jury is still out on that. But let's not forget what's happened in the West in the last 20 years, especially since 2001. I mean, in the United Kingdom, we have detention without trial, we have indefinite detention, we have secret trials, and all the things that we used to complain about in China. Here, nobody's complaining about that in the UK. So, we would argue that we need more democracy and that will help the economy. Well, the jury's still out.
Thank you, Paul, for the controversy, in particular in that area. I have a question, if I may. Merlene has asked a question. Do you agree with the Director General of the WHO that the greatest threat we face now is not the virus itself, it's the lack of global solidarity and global leadership? And I guess we'll ask Christine that. Lack of global solidarity and global leadership.
Yeah, well, the virus isn't, and it doesn't have any agency. It just does what it does, right? It's how we choose to respond to it that's the problem. And that is so obvious. I think, let me just highlight one thing here that I think is absolutely fascinating from my colleague Teresa Capelos, who is at the University of Birmingham. So she's a social psychologist. She's a political psychologist who is working on this idea of reactionism. And there was one thing that came out of a panel that we did recently that I thought was really striking, and that is how does the population think about the scientific method and scientific information? So to the extent that you see people unable to process the scientific method, right, unable to think about facts and logic in an objective way, you're going to have a real problem with the outbreak of the virus, right? Because the leaders that come out of those kinds of systems are the ones that are not, they see science and evidence as potentially serving political purposes. And that becomes a real problem, right? You can't really manage a virus like this. A virus doesn't have a response except just to keep doing what it does, right? You can't lie your way out of this because there are dead bodies to show. So the ways in which I would say populations think about this is largely framed by how they think about scientific information. And I would say as a Remainer, like this is also quite something that has come out very obvious to me, obviously out of Brexit, right? And obviously also how we have processed the information and the idea of expertise and where we put experts and the information that they have into our political system, and the politicization of that information through SAGE, and the ways in which we have used scientists to put forward particular kinds of information when it suits us or when it doesn't suit us. That has become a deep, deep problem, right? The more that science is politicized, the more problems we're going to have. And I would say this is not true just of the UK, it's true in China, and we can see this with the very, very original first protester against this, I can't remember his name, Dr. Wen, I think, who was the first person to say, this is a real problem, we can't lie about this, and trying to say that straight up to his colleagues and to the government. So I think that's the way to think about this. It's not just about global leadership, it's about how we think about information and how we teach people to process information and process scientific information. The leadership point is absolutely true, but we need so much more than that.
Okay, thank you. Paul, any further comments on that, please?
I think, just briefly, I think that if this was an exam question, I would say, this is a question about the US. I mean, to rail against the World Health Organization on the basis that its leader is Ethiopian in origin, I mean, it's just, this is a lack of leadership, which is, we just don't, the West doesn't expect, to have this type of thing. And to say that people are cutting off funding to the World Health Organization just when it needs a lot of more funding, I mean, this is really hitting the bottom of the barrel. And but it's the mutual distrust which is the subtext to this leadership question. because the Chinese don't trust the US just as much these days, just as much as the US trusts China, and to some extent they have good reason for that. But finally, I would make a prediction on the question raised by Josie, which is what's going to be the kind of global public opinion paradigm shift as a result of COVID-19. I think that people will become even obsessively anti-bureaucratic. And I think people will say, you know, if you look at the differences in how countries have been successful in dealing with the problem, some have been very, very bureaucratic and slow and full of officiousness. Others have been more fleet of foot. And if you, I mean, in Europe, you compare Greece, for example, with the United Kingdom, you know, and they're streets ahead in the way that they dealt with things. You know, I think this is going to be, people are going to say, you know, we don't trust the bureaucracy to deal with problems in the way that we used to, and we want more sunlight. We want to look more, and we want to see the corruption too. And we want to see how the machine is working, and we want to look over the shoulder of all these what people describe as, you know, corrupt and lazy bureaucrats. And I think that's I've heard that thing a lot from people privately of different nationalities.
Thank you. Okay, so we're running close to our deadline of 1 hour, but we have a lot of questions coming in. So if everybody agrees, we can go on maybe another 5 or 10 minutes because the participation is so great. Thank you so much for that. So Rodney here says, what's the future role of the UK in all this? And how can Lib Dems themselves show initiative in this area? That's a difficult one, isn't it? Because of course, you know, we can all see where it's all going, but you know, how do we actually react in a way? The UK is, unlike what perhaps that public opinion survey is showing, you know, is actually a fairly small player outside the European Union, and the European Union isn't that strong either in that particular case. So how can we make a difference? So the future role of the UK, that's a bigger issue because that's to do with, of course, with the current government as well, and then our little selves within that paradigm. And I go over to Paul this time for that one. I kick the ball in Paul's direction.
Well, I think the UK is in a very difficult position. It has to work with the European Union. Can't do much on its own, really. But obviously it has to make its views known, especially with respect to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang province, and Uyghurs and so on. But you know, the UK has quite a bit more leverage than I think, you know, your average civil servant in the UK possibly believes, if only they could pull it together in one box, so to speak. Not only to do with the treaty obligations over Hong Kong, but lots of other things as well. And just to be wildly controversial, the UK does have a lot of information about the financial interests of the Chinese, personal financial interests of the Chinese leadership, which they're extremely sensitive about, especially some of the construction companies involved in the Belt and Road, and companies which are based, which are financed from London. I mean, I'm not taking too seriously, but I mean, there is quite a lot of commercial leverage that the UK has through the City of London, which is probably not going to be deployed terribly well.
Okay, that's practical, and indeed, you know, part of the problems that we face in the world, in my personal opinion, is, you know, the strength of the banking sector and so on, in terms of dictating policy through financial flows and so on, and the fact that we cannot, you know, banks are global, you cannot get to grips with them so that they serve the needs of the people. Of course, this is a whole area, another whole area. Christine, do you want to say anything about what the Lib Dems might do as well
Absolutely.
what the UK might do? Oh, good. Well, go for it then. Go for it then.
So I'll say, first of all, at the high level, you know, my way out of this, if there is a way out of this, it is absolutely to work with the other countries who are allies. And I cannot stress that enough. The UK has enormous convening power through multiple routes, right? Still a very close relationship with Europe. Take advantage of that. Commonwealth, take advantage of that. Lots of, you know, still lots of leverage with donor as a huge donor in the world, right? Like arguably, you know, the aid superpower, if you want to put it in those terms. So look, why are we not where take advantage of those relationships, use our convening power. So that's just the first kind of high level thing. But as individuals, I think there's an enormous amount that we could do. And this is basically the conclusion that I came to as somebody who studied politics for a long time, but pretty much remained really largely apolitical, right? Like I did not join a political party until 2016. And I did it so that I could become a bit more involved in foreign policy issues where I felt like I had something to offer. And then Brexit happened. And then, you know, my involvement just ramped up dramatically because I thought this is a moment where people like us or regular people have to speak up. And if you don't fight for it, then you get what you deserve. And I have nothing more to say on this, except if you care about these issues, it is your moral obligation to do something about them. And I don't care which political party you want to join. You know, I happen to be a Lib Dem, but whatever country you're in, be politically active, because that is the route to which change happens. And frankly, like that's the only way, right? You can join all of these various other civil society organizations or whatever, join campaigns. They achieve very limited policy change. The big change happens through political parties, whether we like it or not. So the question is, how politically involved do you want to become if you want to achieve real change? And I think that's the only way forward. I've told this to my academic colleagues who really want to stay out of this. And I've basically said to them, this is a fight for your democratic life. I don't think you quite see it like that yet, but you know, give it 10 or 20 years and you will see that if you didn't get involved, you are morally culpable for what you're going to end up living with.
Tough words, Christine, but also very good words for Lib Dems overseas, because of course we have people in 40 countries outside Europe, and we're active in Hong Kong, for instance, we're active in Afghanistan. We are slowly building our networks. Of course, North America, we now have a very active branch as well, and they're communicating and working with the Democrat Party, or about to work with the Democrat Party. So I think there is a means here, for instance, in which the Lib Dems have a lot of people overseas. They're both Lib Dems in Europe, you have Lib Dems in France, or Lib Dems overseas. And these are people that can be, and through these organizations, you can be active politically. So we're faced with a dilemma, for instance, in Hong Kong, where probably the national security law will come into force, we're told, by our Lib Dems in Hong Kong on the 1st of July. So we're trying to make all kinds of communications and connections concerning that and liaison with the protesters. And this is the kind of thing in which we have links, both because, of course, as Lib Dems, we're allowed to have, we can have people from any country join us. So, for instance, I'm welcoming particularly Ephraim Mukawa, who is asking questions from Zambia, because he is a Zambian who wants to get involved in Lib Dems overseas and work for democracy in his country. I'm going to now get to his message, if I may. And he says, I'm Zambian, and my question has to do with the way China has penetrated the African continent. How do you interpret the shrinking democratic space and rampant corruption in relation to China's presence in some of these countries like Zambia, Southern Africa? And I should ask Paul this time.
Well,
Africa.
yeah, the Chinese investment in Zambian copper has not been a very pleasant experience, and treatment of workers and this type of thing, and low wages, and then Chinese workers coming over and taking some of the key jobs and then leaving because they don't like the conditions, and then they put loose and fancy free in Zambia. All sorts of difficulties there. DRC is the same. I mean, there are Chinese bandits on the road from Kinshasa to Kisangani, which takes a month to traverse, by the way, because there's a Chinese workers that were working in a factory in DRC, which had very bad conditions, and they left, and they built their own village, and there were all sorts of crazy things going on. So I mean, the Chinese investment in Africa is a bit of a mixed picture. It's not all bad, but on the question of the show, so I think it'd be good to try and get China to kind of subscribe to better investment standards around the world, and I think there's some leverage to achieve that. On the Lib Dem question, the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom wants to sign a trade deal with China related to Brexit. It's not going to come anytime soon, but I would say by the time the British get around to negotiating a trade deal with China, the UK will probably be back in the customs union by then, because we're talking about 10 years from now, probably. So they're going to be wasting their time and effort on that. This is not. I mean, the initial exploratory talks have not gone well, and there's a reason for that, which is the British try and be very, very nice to China and do all sorts of things to build the relationship commercially, leading up to some kind of longer-term arrangement. And then the minister then supports something Mike Pompeo says, and all their effort goes out of the window. So they're getting the worst of both worlds. They're not getting a better trade relationship, and neither are they getting any voice on human rights and Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. So both they're getting the worst of both worlds. At least the Liberal Democrats have a clear view of where the human rights issues are, what to do about it, who to cooperate with in Uyghurs and Hong Kong, and are very active. And roll on the Lib Dem government when we can deal with these things in a more mature way.
Okay, Christine, over to you, please. On Africa, your expertise, please.
Yes. So I think the first thing to say about this, I mean, I write a lot about corruption, actually. A good chunk of my book is on corruption. And I would say this is not all about China, right? Like, China is just a piece of a bigger corruption picture. And I have a long and complicated and complex story around how we think and talk about corruption that is much more fine-grained and nuanced than how we're dealing with it, I think, typically in the West, right? It's never black and white. But with respect to China's role in this, I would say think of China more as feeding into a system that is already working like this, that China's politics are much more like patronage politics. And we have a lot of patronage politics in the West as well. So let's not say that we don't work like this. But I would say, the Chinese system currently, as it stands, is more like that. And so are African politics. African politics are about patronage politics. So those systems are already sort of aligned. They already understand and have a similar way of doing business, and one really feeds into the other. And so they're already quite simpatico, and they understand how things work already in the same way. It's that the West sees things quite differently, or is trying to separate out these things that are not as black and white in African context as we want them to be, right? So think of it more as we are trying to impose a set of rules and values onto a system that doesn't see things and value things the same way that we do, and then that actually China's system actually looks more like what they're already doing, and so it's easier to work together in those kinds of ways, right? So without demonizing, and I think that without demonizing is really the key here. So I think the corruption issue is much harder and more complex, and I'm sure that Ephraim sort of will see what I'm saying when I make those kinds of comments. It's a little bit, I have these conversations with people in Divid all the time, and with people in the foreign policy community, and it's always, the first thing to point out is we operate in much the same ways, but we call them different things. We hide behind lobbyists, and we hide behind formalized versions of corruption. And so if we think about ourselves all along the same spectrum, it's a little bit less antagonistic. But I wanted to answer the question. There's a question directed to me just around the Canada issue and how to deal with the two Michaels. And this is something that I, as a Canadian, I am very upset about, because I feel like that could have been me. It could have been my parents. It could have been any, friends of mine, anybody basically that travels to, any Canadian, frankly, actually any British citizen that travels to China and happens to be doing whatever they're doing there could be just plucked out and dumped into a Chinese jail and held forever, and possibly worse, right? So this is just kidnapping as a tool of foreign policy is turning into a thing, right? Iran has been doing it for a while, and I don't like the fact that this might turn into a new kind of norm that is really, really deeply disturbing. But having said that, I think this is a situation where Trump put Canada in by leveraging the US-Canada relationship to the max, because Canada basically has to do what the US says for the most part. I know Canadians don't want to hear that, but that is just the truth, right? There's a lot of leverage on the US side. Canadian economy is, you know, whatever it was when I was growing up, I think 60 or 70%. Sorry, the US economy is about 60 or 70% of the Canadian economy, right? Like it feeds deeply into our GDP. There's not a lot we can do about that. So Canada basically has to do what the US says, and we fall under the US security umbrella. So there's not a great answer to this particular issue, that basically when you've got somebody like Trump exploiting a relationship that we have had forever and ever, and turning it into a moment of political leverage to get what it needs in order to get something done in the domestic sphere, Canada's just basically vulnerable to that. And unless, you know, the way to have done it really was to align all of the other democracies and countries to say, look, Canada's going to take the hit on this one, and we are going to back Canada up all the way, right? That's the way to have done it properly. And I think if Obama had been in charge and that was the thing that was going to happen, that's the way it would have been done. But we've got Trump. And so Canada's stuck in this situation. And as long as, you know, there's a threat to constantly renegotiate NAFTA or any one of a number of Canadian interests in the US, there's nothing we can do. And this is going to happen to Australia. It's going to happen to South Korea. It's going to happen to Japan. It's going to happen to the UK at some point, right? So that's where it's going.
Thank you. And with that thought, we have to close. I think we've had a tremendous session with 30 minutes over, with apologies for those that couldn't ask questions, but we've certainly got a record of all the comments that have been made. I want to thank our two speakers, Christine and Paul, for very insightful comments. I want to particularly thank Merlene from Lib Dems Overseas, who has been very, very good at organizing all this and keeping us all online. And also Christopher for the Paddy Ashdown Forum. I just want to reiterate what has been said, that the Lib Dems are doing this important think through concerning policy, international relations, and that most of you, I hope, are members. If not, please join the Lib Dems, because you can participate in this. This is a very open party that listens to everybody and tries to come up with the right solutions based on the right values and hopefully the realities that the UK is facing in its unfortunate situation at the moment. So we want all your ideas. You've shown you have a lot of ideas, so please participate in this international relations working group. Thank you all. And please join Lib Dems Overseas. libdemsoverseas.com is awaiting you to join, so that we can also be active in many parts of the world. We have people here from Latin America, people here in Africa. We want you all in. We're strong in Asia Pacific, we're strong in North America, but we need to cover the whole world. Welcome. Come and join Lib Dems Overseas as well. Cheerio and thank you. Have a nice Sunday afternoon.